Came here to have fun in Nashville, and we had this big cheer, and now we're talking about...
Jesus, end of life, two-dimensional.
That's some pretty heavy stuff. Welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast, everyone. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we today are coming live to you from Nashville, Tennessee. And when I say live, I mean live recorded. We're like not broadcasting live, but we have this incredible audience here that has come from all over. I mean, it's far away from Turkey. We have people here from the UK, California, Georgia, all over the United States. I don't think we have any Canadians come, but that's okay. We'll get them next time. We're glad everyone's here, and we thought we would create a podcast experience with everyone that is present. So one of the things that we can do is go right to some questions that people might have today, because we want to curate some of this. We did an online survey on YouTube where we asked people, what would you like to talk about? Would you like to have us curate a conversation in Nashville around personality types and careers? Would you like to do personality types and family and children, around relationships, around shadow work and Jungian concepts? And overwhelmingly, there was voted that shadow work and Jungian concepts, it was on the high list. I was surprised by that, Antonia. Were you?
I am and I'm not. So we recently gave a talk to the British Association of Psychological Type, and we discussed bridging different generations of type. There is a real distinction in how each of the generations approach type. And a bit of this comes from generational theory, which we've done podcasts on before, which is a theory that was developed by William Strauss and Neil Howe. And they talk about how each of the generations, and I'll just, talk about a couple of them, like baby boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, how they have distinctive characteristics and qualities that come with the generation. So it makes sense that we're all going to have just a little slightly different take on type depending upon the generation that we're from, because we grew up in a slightly different world, right? The experiences that we have depending upon the generation that we're raised in give us a worldview, like an imprint, almost like a wiring that gets laid on top of our personality type. And one of the things we mentioned was that there is a real distinction, almost like a bifurcation of people who were raised with a modernist perspective, which is primarily baby boomers and early Gen Xers, and people who were raised with a primarily postmodern perspective, which are the majority of millennials and now the up-and-coming what are called Gen Zs. Who knows if that'll stick? My guess is that it will. And depending upon the worldview you grew up with, there's going to be assumptions that we make about what it is that we need, want, must have, and how we create a relationship to type. So older generations with a more modernist perspective, they have a tendency to be a little bit more careful, more professional, right? They have a tendency to have some class and are very focused on application. But the thing that got sacrificed in application is depth, right? There was a lot of career coaching that happened during that time period, and that meant that they just weren't going to go as far down the rabbit's hole, because the assumption is that businesses don't really want all of that information. Gen Xers got a hold of type, and they did what they do. They started hacking it, right? They started merging technology with type and trying to figure out ways to scale it and continue to develop it. One of the examples of this would be our friend Dr. Dario Nardi, who has been doing research with EEG machines and how our brains operate and sort of show up with our circuitry depending upon our personality types and how we're using different functions. And that's, of course, the basis of subtypes that we've been recently talking about in our career podcasts. And then millennials got a hold of it. And millennials, they want depth, all right? And one of the reasons is that in a postmodern world, we don't have a single stream of information. We don't have like a one set of encyclopedias. We have the internet, which gives us all the information. So millennials, they got hungry for that information and they want depth. The challenge is that they also come from a very academic, what should I say here? Academic propaganda about how they have to go be as educated as humanly possible in order to succeed. And it's worked out for some, but not all. And they bring that desire for academia, but also to have the right answer. And so millennials have a relationship to type that looks more like conversation, discussion, consensus, 4-hour conversations on the internet about what extroverted thinking is.
Discovery.
Right? Discovery.
Yeah.
And so they have a real desire for depth. And we were talking about bridging these different generations is looking for some organizing principle that will feed the need for boomers' desire for application, right? The Gen X desire for further discovery and scaling, and the millennial desire for depth and to really personalize it, to really understand the self using these functions or type as a tool. And of course, Gen Z's watching, and they'll probably adopt it however we tell them to adopt it to some extent, right? Or they'll make it their own, who knows? But they're watching. And so one of the organizing principles that we put forward is using type not just at its source of Isabel and Catherine, not just at the source of understanding it as an instrument that helps us, suss out some type preferences, but all the way back to Jung and what his original intent was for type, which was inner inquiry, understanding who we are, deep diving into the self, and applying it through growth and development. So I've started to see maybe define personal growth as accelerated maturity. That's what personal growth is. When we grow, we're just trying to accelerate our maturity. And some of us grow because we've been slapped around by life a little bit and realize we're behind, and that accelerated maturity is for us to catch up. And sometimes we get bit by a bug and we can't stop, and we catch up, and then we keep going further and we keep going further, which is why, as we talked about today at our Personality Life Path program, personal growth is a lonely path. Because pretty soon you're outpacing other people in maturity, right? It's hard to find peers. It's hard to find people who can talk about the same things that you want to talk about. But type gives us a really interesting access to not just accelerating our maturity and growing as people, but it also gives us a capacity to see the things about ourselves that we really would prefer to never have reflected back to us. And that's the content and material that lives in the shadow. And that's what people are hungry for. They want concepts around shadow. They want to go deeper. They want to understand it. But the challenge is that it can't be theoretical. This is bridging the concept of generation and type. It has to be applied. And when one applies type and understands shadow work, there is a whole world that opens up. This was Jung's original purpose. He wrote psychological types after basically a midlife crisis. He wrote it because it was an understanding and awareness that he came to when what he was working with wasn't working anymore. And what shadow work does for us, or can do, if we don't see it as theory, if we see it as application, it can help us diagnose things that set us up for a much better conclusion to our life. So the conclusion being, at around midlife, I suspect, and I don't know this to be true, so don't write any of this down, okay? But we have an opportunity that opens up, almost like when we're young. And we understand early childhood development through circuits that open up, and then we get imprinted with certain ideas, and we carry those throughout our lives. And there's certain moments of maturation, like we're ready for potty training at a certain point. We're ready to, go out and discover the world. We hit puberty. There's all sorts of things that develop. But most people don't talk about midlife. And midlife, I suspect, has its own circuit that opens up. It's another growth opportunity that presents itself. And we have a choice. Jung called this the choice between one-sidedness and individuation. One-sidedness is we double down on more of what we've been doing. We go, nope, I've figured it out, right? I'm me, and I'm going to keep doing the thing that got me here, and I'm going to keep doubling down whether or not it's causing any problems. And if it is causing problems, I'm not going to look at that directly, and I'm going to say it's everybody else's fault, and I'm just going to keep riding that hard. And those are the people we talk to who at the end of their lives feel very two-dimensional, right? Almost like, I remember you were more with it when you were younger, right? Like it seemed like you were more sort of fleshed out as a person, but at the end of your life, you're sort of becoming a cardboard cutout version of yourself, almost two-dimensional.
I remember this with my grandparents. I remember seeing them and watching them close down things they had opened 10 years before. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I fear that's going to happen to me or my parents. Like, I hope they don't lose the things that they were attuned to, part of the personal growth stuff that they had done, or the ways they've become later in life. I think it's a big fear of mine. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons I do personal growth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's one path. Another path is the path of individuation. Individuation just means, I mean, if you break it down, in means not, and individuation means divided, not divided. We can go down the path of understanding who we are in a complete picture. Jung called it whole self. We can also call it self with a capital S. It's the whole picture. It's the whole enchilada, or as much of it as we can consume in a single lifetime. Because, of course, we'll die before we get to know all of ourselves. And particularly because all of ourselves are iterating and becoming more every day. So it's also a verb, right? I aming, right? I'm constantly and perpetually becoming a new version of myself all the time. And I'll die before understanding that complete package is done. But that's okay, right? But we can get as far as possible down that road of bringing all of that self in. And that's the path of individuation. And those are the older people you talk to who are the sages, the crones, the people who have real wisdom to share.
Yeah. So we're here together to curate a live podcast experience. We set the tone with the shadow, talking about Jungian shadow stuff. Man, that's heavy right out of the gate, right? It's like, came here to have fun in Nashville, and we had this big cheer, and now we're talking about...
Jesus, end of life, two-dimensional.
That's some pretty heavy stuff. But let's see if we can find some practical ways to engage with this. I know there were some people who had questions earlier around some of these things. I was probably supposed to make a list and remember who was in what order, but we're just going to freeform this. We're going to make this up as we go. I have 2 microphones ready for you to be part. You know, we always talk about here at Personality Hacker, at the end of a podcast, you probably heard me say 1,000,000 times, or at least 487 times, or something like that, roughly at the time of this recording. Hey, we're at the end of the podcast. You've been hearing the conversation. It's only been myself and Antonia. We don't have a third microphone, but we do want to hear from you, and I give you instruction to go over and leave a comment. Well, you're here with us live, so why not actually have a third and even a fourth? I got real radical, a 4th microphone tonight. So we have way more options for both sides of the room for us to be able to go into some questions around some of this. So I know right here, I think you had something, right before we started, we kind of got a little bit of a curation before we started to get a sense of what people want to talk about. And you had something that's probably going to piggyback right off of her from definitional. So why don't we hand him the microphone and or bring the microphone to him. What's your name, sir?
John.
And where are you from, John?
Portland, Oregon.
Portland, Oregon. Thank you for being here tonight. So what is your best fit type preferences?
I'm an ENTP.
ENTP. Okay. Could you frame the question in a way that would help land it for you?
Yeah, the question was, online I've seen people talk about shadow functions in different ways. So just a basic understanding of what Jung meant by that and what that actually is, if we're talking about it, would be really helpful.
All right, great. So Jung didn't talk about shadow functions. He talked about our shadow. And our shadow is effectively, there's a little bit, it's controversial, all right, even amongst Jungian psychotherapists and people in that whole world. But the school of thought that I subscribe to, the one that I think is the most helpful, is that the shadow is basically the unconscious. Right? It's anything we don't want to look at. And it doesn't have to be all bad material. It can be good stuff. It's just whatever it is that we don't want to face for some reason. And so the shadow is separate from shadow functions as far as Jung was concerned. That said, Dr. John Beebe, who is like 1 degree of separation from Carl Jung, meaning that he studied with people who studied with Jung. And John Beebe has a lifetime of work, which is pretty spectacular, actually. And I totally poo-pooed and did not take seriously until I fully understood it. And it required us doing private coaching with John and just going, what is this thing you're talking about? Tell me more. And it was his theory. He calls it the 8-function model or 8-function theory, that indicates that the shadow functions are the functions that he describes as ego dystonic. Okay, so there's ego syntonic functions and ego dystonic functions. Ego-syntonic functions are all of the functions we identify with. So that would be the first four. They're technically called the dominant, the auxiliary, the tertiary, and the inferior. We call them in the car model, the driver, the co-pilot, the 10-year-old, and the 3-year-old. And you could just call them 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. So there are 4 more functions, right? So what do we do with those guys? And I always thought, well, it's a mixed bag, right? Depends on who you're raised by and whether or not you have an association or awareness with that. And I do think that that's still true to some extent. But the shadow functions, according to John's model, is functions 5 through 8 are the same as functions 1 through 4, but with an opposite attitude. So the attitude is whether or not a function is pointed outward and is extroverted or inward and is introverted. So you take your 4 functions of whatever your personality type is, and then you just reverse the attitude, and those are your shadow functions. Or ego-dystonic, meaning that I don't really identify with those, right? When I hear them described, I'm like, yeah, that's somebody else's thing. That's not mine. That's really what that means. Ego-dystonic. It's a really cool sounding word, though. So I like to use it a lot because it makes me feel smart. So what does that mean? It means that our relationship to these functions are unconscious for us. They're in the shadow. And when they come up for us, maybe it's a moment of like, oh, that was interesting, or that's not really how I usually operate, or maybe we're just not watching it at all. And our 4 shadow functions can be triggered in 2 different contexts. The first one is when somebody else is using it and it rubs us the wrong way and we have a reaction to it. So that's the first. The second is when we have that part of us called up and it takes on a certain energy. Now, in John's model, it's not just that they're in the shadow and unconscious. All 8 functions take on an archetypal energy. And the archetypal energies are, if that's interesting to you, I can say them. Okay.
Oh, he's an ENTP. He wants all the data.
Give me all the information.
Info. It's like, just give it to me. Right. Just feed me the information.
All right. Stop me if you've heard it. Okay. So the archetypal energies are as follows. The first function, the dominant, is the hero function. What does that mean to have a hero function? It means you think it's the right tool for all the jobs. Right? It's the conquering hero. It's the function you identify with the most. It is the thing that you believe is always the right solution. Right? And when it's not, you're super surprised and think everybody else is dumb and stupid for not understanding that this is clearly the right solution. Right? But it doesn't like to get its hands dirty. Right? Because it's the function we most identify with, so it doesn't want to do any of the dirty jobs. It just wants to come in like a white knight and save the day. Right? It's got a little flapping cape, and it's like it just wants to do all the things, but it doesn't really want to mar up its white gloves. Okay? Because we don't want to see ourselves this way. That's why it's our ego. We want to see ourselves as super awesome and never doing the wrong thing and always moral and upright, except for that one time that I did that one thing, but that we don't talk about that, right? Our ego wants to see us as the best. And so our first function, the one that we identify with the most, that's the best. That's the best because I'm the best, and that is always the best, and it always does the best thing. The second function, the auxiliary, or what we call the co-pilot, is a parent function. Okay? And that means that we instinctively use it in behalf of other people. Our catchphrase, if Personality Hacker had a catchphrase, it would be, develop the co-pilot, work on the co-pilot, develop your auxiliary function. And another way of saying it is use that not just in behalf of other people, but self-parent with this function. Use it in behalf of yourself because it is instinctively being called upon for other people. Now use it for you. Have a personal relationship to it. And you can see this, all of you who have, say, intuition as a second function, right? All the INPs and ENJs. Somebody else comes up to you and goes, I just can't figure out what I'm supposed to do with my life. And you're like, well, I know. I immediately have a whole vision for you and a whole plan, right? And then somebody comes up and goes, what's your vision for yourself? And you're like, things? I don't know, right? And that works for all people in their second function, right? It's a parent. You can use it for other people, but self-parenting, that's a little different. The third function, the tertiary, what we call the 10-year-old, is the eternal child. And this is the function that has the energy of wanting to be loved. And so we have a tendency to do a little overcompensating with this. We go, I'm really good at this, right? I'm super awesome. You should see how awesome I am. And it's the equivalent to showing toys to guests when they come over to your parents' house. You're like, this is the coolest thing, right? It's a Lincoln Log house and I totally built it. It's awesome, right? And the person's like, yeah, it's a good job. I like your Lincoln Logs. And that's our relationship to our 10-year-old, our tertiary function, right? We're showing everybody how awesome we are at it. The fourth function is what's called the anima or animus. This gets a little crazier. And I think earlier we also had a question of, can you say more about how that's the gateway to the shadow? Well, John would slap my hand if I said that. John would say, it's the gateway to the unconscious. And I'm like, but the unconscious is the shadow. So I go ahead and use it interchangeably, but he takes umbrage to that, and I have no idea why. John, tell me why. So the reason why this is a gateway to our unconscious or to our shadow functions is because this is the first time we enter a space where we are deeply uncertain. Our third function, we're uncertain, but as long as somebody gives us a head pat, we go, okay, I did that okay. We get to the fourth function, and now we are deeply uncertain. It doesn't matter how many times people say we did a good job in that, we're still a little uncertain. I call it the did I leave the iron on phenomena. Like when you leave the house, maybe you have an appointment 60 minutes away. You drove 55 minutes, you're 5 minutes away from it, and you go, oh crap, did I leave the iron on? Well, you have the option to drive all the way back home, or you can just go, hope the house doesn't burn down. And that's kind of our relationship with our fourth function, right? It's always unsettling. We're always a little uncertain about it, even if we're good at it, even if we've developed it, even if we would say maybe have some sophistication. We're still a little uncertain. Well, not a little. We're actually deeply uncertain. And that uncertainty and an ability to make peace with it, because as humans, when we're uncertain, we take that as a red flag. We assume something is wrong because we feel uncertain, right? And so we go, well, that must be a bad thing. So I'm just not even gonna look at that. But we really need to, with that fourth function, we need to be able to hang with that uncertainty. Hanging with the uncertainty is how we integrate it. And that means not only do we have to hang with the uncertainty, but we have to hang with the fact that part of us that is egosyntonic, meaning that we know this is a part of who we are. We have to hang with that. It's never going to be awesome. It's never going to be a hero. It's never going to conquer anything. It's just going to be a thing that we have to contend with all the time for the rest of our lives. And that gives us modesty. And modesty and humility, that's the toll we pay to the toll booth on the other side of the shadow, right? That's why it's the bridge, is that we have to pay with making peace with uncertainty. And if we can do that, then we get access to the unconscious, because the unconscious is nothing but uncertainty. That's what it is, right? It's nothing but reflected back uncertainty, insecurity, not sure if it's okay. So then we go 5 through 8. The fifth function is, and you can almost see, just like they are the opposite attitude, you could also see them as mirror reflections of the first 4. If you see the first 4 as maybe different degrees of uncertainty, the first function, it's overconfident, right? And you know this because have somebody try to insult you using your first function. They can't do it, all right? If somebody's like, your pattern recognition is terrible, Antonia, and you're really bad at like connecting the dots, I'd be like, okay, that's whatever you're talking about for you. Right. Have anybody try to insult you in your first function? It can't. You go, you're an idiot, right? The second function, if somebody insults you, go, that's fair. All right, and like, I got some work to do on that. But when you perform it well, you go, yeah, I performed that well. You have a sense of certainty. It's a modest sense of certainty, but it's still certainty. When you get to the third function, you're uncertain and you're looking for the head pats. You need somebody else to tell you did a good job. But once they do, you go, okay. When you get to the fourth one, you're deeply uncertain. And that same sense of certainty follows into the shadow. So our fifth function is the almost like an archetypal reflection of the first. Jung calls it the opposing personality, and he meant that to reflect in psychology oppositional personality disorder. That's why he originally called it that. I've heard it called other things online like nemesis, but I passed this by John last time I talked to him, and he gave me a gold star, so I'm going to go ahead and go with it. But I don't think it's a nemesis. I think it's a mercenary. Every hero has a mercenary, right? The sort of world-weary fighter that is a gun for hire, that just goes in and gets the job done and doesn't really need a lot of fanfare, right? Like, it's okay if you throw a couple gold coins at them and give them a bowl of stew, right? And that's all they expected. But my goodness, will they get the job done, right? It's like, go kill that person. All right, go kill that person. Whereas the hero's like, what? I would never. That's not a heroic thing to do. But here's the thing. The mercenary borrows certainty from the hero. So when it goes and does that thing, it doesn't have uncertainty. It just had to go get the job done, right? It's almost like a cleanup crew. And so it's more of a mercenary feel. And our fifth function does that. For me, it's introverted intuition. And it shows up when my hero is tired, weary, failing, not getting the job done, doesn't want to get its hands dirty, right? When my extroverted intuition is like, I would never think that. My introverted intuition is like, I'm thinking that. Okay? That's that fifth function. The sixth function has the same sort of archetypal energy of the second. If the second is a parent, then the sixth is a critical parent. It's also called a witch or a senex. And this is the part of us that places curses upon other people. Right? It's like, you might have gotten a B+, but why didn't you get the A? Right? And it's like, you should have done better. It's like a critical piece. And then if it gets mad enough, it's like, I curse thee so that you may never get A's ever again. Right? It's got this like vindictive quality to it. But it also has the same certainty of the parent. So it doesn't really question itself very much. It just usually gets called up when there's not something to be taken care of, but a person who has wronged you, crossed you, right? And by the way, these shadow archetypal energies, they sound like bad news, but we have to have them because the world doesn't play fair, right? People cross us all the time. They do nasty things to us. They put us in terrible situations. What, our hero who doesn't want to get its hands dirty is supposed to handle all of that? Right? We're always supposed to do the good thing all the time, always? Or do we have to play dirty sometimes? And that's why the shadow is available. But we don't want to see that about ourselves because we're upstanding people. But that shadow is there ready to have our back. Right? The seventh function is the archetypal antidote to the third function. If the third function is a child, the seventh function is a trickster, which is also a child energy. But as opposed to looking for head pats, it doesn't think it's ever going to get approval, so it's sneaky. All right? It's a sneaky little energy. John calls it undermining and putting us in double binds. It's the part of us that creates lose-lose situations, or at least things that don't feel like we can really get out of them. It's like a finger trap. And you'll have to figure out how that works in your life. But my goodness, my introverted feeling has put me in some double binds that took a long time to get out of.
We actually culturally codify this as a Western culture. The holiday of Halloween, we actually embody the trickster energy. When a child goes up to a house to ask for candy, what do they say? They put the person in a double bind by saying, you either give me a treat or I'll play a trick on you. Now, we don't actually play tricks as much in our culture. It's more of a affectation of it. But that is trickster energy that we've created an entire holiday around. Trick or treat. We create a double bind for the person on the other side. Mm-hmm. And so this archetypal energy shows up there celebrated, but in our lives, we have double binds all over the place. We've either created for ourselves or others have created for us.
Exactly. And it's an important energy, by the way. All right? It actually has our back a lot. And then finally, you have the eighth function, which is sort of a mirror of the fourth. Now, the fourth is called the anima or animus. And this is the opposite gender that you identify with. This is that energy. And the fourth function, I didn't really talk about it, but it's like it's the part of ourselves that we have a hard time really understanding, but is still incredibly important. We can't ever fully create a relationship with it like this, because it's never going to perfectly seamlessly integrate with our first function. It just doesn't. They're polarity opposites. They're not the same, right? They have opposite agendas. They have opposite things they're looking for, but they're also two sides of the same coin. So integrating that fourth function is understanding that it is the opposite of how we see ourselves, and yet it is us. The eighth function also has a dualistic personality. It's very Janus-like. John calls it the demon/daemon. Now, a demon, as John mentions, is evilly undermining. And this is a function that evilly undermines us, right? And it puts us in terrible situations. It puts other people in terrible situations, and it needs to sometimes, and then sometimes it does it needlessly. But it also has a daemon quality. Daemon was a creature that was half god, half human, and was considered an access point to the divine. So this eighth function can be evilly undermining, or it can be an access point to the divine, interestingly enough. And John's speculation is that we, in the first half of our life, can have either a demon or daemon relationship with it, and the second half of our life will have the opposite relationship to it. So sometimes we don't even have to worry about the eighth function for like the first half of our life. We're like, I don't even know what you're talking about. I have a perfectly fine relationship with our eighth function. And midlife hits, and all of a sudden it's like, why isn't this working anymore? Or vice versa. Struggle. I can't get this down. I can't figure this out. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I think I figured this out. Right? And so it's kind of a similar dualistic quality. And it is also deeply uncertain. It has the same quality of deep uncertainty as our fourth function. So what is the shadow? The shadow is the part of us that has our back, just like a mercenary would have a hero's back. Just like the critical parent plays the bad cop to the good cop of the nurturing parent. Just like the trickster is sneaky and has the child that just wants to be loved all the time, but maybe is in a bad situation and needs somebody to be have a trickster energy to get it out of a bind. And just like there's a part of us that has a demon and daemonic quality, there's also a resonance with the anima or animus, which is also a dualistic character or feeling. So the shadow is effectively the part of us that has our back when we don't want to see that we're capable of doing things that meet reality where reality is at. When reality does terrible things to us, there's a part of us that's willing to fight dirty. But we put all of that in the shadow because we don't want to see ourselves that way. And Jung did say that the shadow can only be understood when it's reflected back by another psyche. It's a psyche-to-psyche experience. So our shadow, we can't access on our own. We just can't. It has to be reflected back to us. And when it's reflected back to us, it's incredibly important what we do with that. Because the first thing, the instinct, is to say, the person reflecting the shadow back, you're the problem. You're at fault. Reflecting it back means that you just did something to me. Or if we do sufficient work, particularly our fourth function, where we're willing to see, oh yeah, I have weaknesses. I have things that aren't great. I have parts of myself that I'm actually never going to be anything other than deeply uncertain. If we can pay the toll of uncertainty to cross that bridge, then we can, when we have our shadow reflected back to us, we can go, yep, that's me. That's me. I do that. Right? I do that. And then we have access to whole self. Right? And you can tell when somebody's done this work, as John said, you didn't ask this, but I'm going to add it anyway. John said that when we do shadow work, the first thing people tell is our persona changes. So our persona is the access point that we allow other people in society, right? Our persona doesn't have to be a fake mask. It can just be a slice of ourselves that we're allowing other people to see. It's our interface. Now, when you have a perfectly curated persona, right, and you're constantly adjusting it and making sure that people only see just exactly what you want them to see, that's when our persona becomes a problem. In fact, it's such a heavy lift because we're doing that since we're afraid people are going to see all that shadow material behind us. And we're hiding it from ourselves, much less them, so they can only see this pristine persona. But when we do shadow work, we make peace with our shadow, we make peace with our fourth function, we just kind of rest into it and go, yeah, that's me too. The tell is that our persona relaxes. We have a lot more flexibility and a lot more capacity for people to see the real us. We give them an access point that's a little bit more fleshed out, a little bit more real, a little bit more authentic. And those two things, they sort of counterbalance each other. So if a person has a really pristine, curated persona, they probably have a very heavy, ignored shadow. And if they have a chill vibe, authentic interface, more of a relaxed persona, they're probably making peace with all that content that they would rather not see, but they're doing it anyway. So that's our shadow.
Yeah. So thank you, everybody. I think this is a good place to stop. I'd like to reset and also then start to get more questions from the audience, because I think this is an important thing to go into, some of the shadow stuff, because people had asked about it. I think a lot of people would like to know, okay, well, how is this defined? How is this explained? So let's go ahead and close this episode out, and then let's open up a new episode so everybody here, and we'll talk a little bit more and get some questions and some feedback and some advice and some of that kind of stuff. So if you're listening at home or watching at home, thank you for being part of this. Now it's your turn. You are not here in Nashville with us. You haven't been able to share on the microphone, but you can come over to our website, personalityhacker.com, and directly below this episode, leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your story. Stories are amazing because they're compressed experiences you can share with us and other people that we can hear what your experience was. So come over, make your voice heard at personalityhacker.com.
Okay. And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, it helps us out a lot. We have a video podcast now on YouTube. You might be watching us on YouTube. And if you enjoyed this episode, you can like, subscribe, and hit the bell to get notifications for future episodes. And we have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk to you, with you, on the next Personality Hacker podcast.